If you are an EMS CQI leader on a quest to improve clinical quality and reduce risk to your patients, your EMS providers, and your EMS agency, or an EMS physician medical director with significant clinical oversight responsibilities, but a limited budget or administrative support, then this show is for you. Hello, everyone. I am Kevin Kelly. He's Paul Gerard. We are Gerard & Associates, your national EMS CQI consulting firm. You're listening to the G&A Way EMS CQI podcast, available on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, everywhere you get your EMS CQI shows and news. Please hit those subscribe buttons. We're grateful you tuned in. Paul, how are you, man?
I am well. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So
Good.
This is the first show of the new year. Happy New Year.
Oh, thank you. You too. You too.
And kicking this off with a show about medical direction and how important that role is, how misunderstood that role is, and let's kick it off. What we at Gerard & Associates, we deal quite a bit with medical directors.
Mm-hmm.
And we deal with it mainly from the side of EMS CQI and from the context of the paramedic. You and I are both retired paramedics. We are not physicians. We're not physician medical directors. So it is in that context that we have this discussion. And the other thing is we didn't reach out to any medical directors for their input. So this is really from what we have seen, and this context, the G&A Way context, 20 years, 500,000 run reports reviewed, hundreds of thousands of EMS CQI one-on-ones. That is our context. So with that in mind, Paul, what is the role of the EMS physician medical director in today's EMS systems?
Yeah, today's medical director really has to be quite a bit more sophisticated than in years past, I think. But the primary goal for the medical director in an EMS system is really to be that clinical care guidepost, right? That the bellwether of, our care needs to meet a certain standard, and that's the person who's going to help us meet that standard. So that encompasses a variety of things, but the overarching theme is that they're responsible for the care that goes on in the streets every day.
And that responsibility comes with it some obligations, and one of those obligations is to not be the buddy with the paramedic and actually be in that oversight leadership role, and that creates some cognitive dissonance. Frequently, there's some dissension between medical directors and the frontline paramedics, disagreements about protocols, disagreements about interpretation of data, issues and ambiguities in clinical documentation. And the medical director has got to be much more than just that EMS CQI data-driven check-the-box type of role. How as far as dealing with day-to-day issues that evolve in CQI, what are some of the skill sets that you have seen in some of the more successful relationships between medical directors and the paramedic?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially if you're in the market and shopping around for a new medical director. In my mind, at least, and we would deal with agencies across the country, all different personalities and styles of medical directors. And we have everything from the don't bother me unless you kill somebody. That's all I want to hear about. If I've got to get involved, it's only if something really bad happened. All the way through to kind of micromanagement medical directors who ride the truck and they want to input on everything that comes out of management in terms of policies. They want to have the ability to give an opinion on those, even if they sometimes don't directly relate to patient care. They feel that they should have a say in stuff, right down to staffing and resource allocation, that sort of thing. So there's really a huge spectrum. But in reality, as far as the success categories that we see are typically medical directors who are more engaged and want to be involved, as opposed to those who want lesser activity, especially in today's fast-paced environment, you really need active medical direction and somebody who's going to help you to define the care that's being provided. But really, interpersonal skills is another critical factor. So we have some medical directors who are really by the book, black and white, kind of strict. The providers tend to shy away from interacting with those types of medical directors. They tend to want to kind of hide in the corner and not have their medical director pick on them. And that's detrimental to the CQI process, I believe. And the reverse is the opposite end of that spectrum, as you mentioned previously, Kevin, is you have some medical directors who want to be so well liked by their providers that they don't hold their feet to the fire. And these same attributes and traits, you could say, are attributes and traits that the CQI coach needs to have a handle on as well. So you really can't have either one of those extremes. If you have somebody who's a good communicator, who's accessible to the everyday provider, who's involved with the agency intimately enough that he or she knows a lot of the providers by name, if not at least by sight, and they should have a good grasp of what that agency is doing and not doing and what they need to improve.
How does one become a medical director?
Well, again, every state is different and every jurisdiction has different requirements. We have some medical directors who are primary care physicians, who are anesthesiologists, who are DOs, and in some jurisdictions that's okay. Others require you to be board certified in something, preferably emergency medicine or some other critical area. So I think that varies jurisdiction to jurisdiction in terms of what the requirements are to be a medical director and how you get there. Some medical directors came up through the ranks and they've worked with EMS. They were previous providers, perhaps, and others, as I mentioned, might be the local pediatrician for the local communities, the only physician who wanted to get involved and help out, doesn't have a good, strong background in emergency care and emergency medicine or EMS necessarily, but wants to help his community. So there is no, there are a lot of agencies, National Association of EMS Physicians and those types of agencies that try to put forth some sort of standards, but those standards don't need to be required in a lot of places. So you get that variability state to state, region to region.
So it runs the gamut.
It does.
From a physician. I mean, obviously the baseline qualification is you have to have a physician's license. But it runs the gamut from no pre-hospital care experience to, say, for example, what I'm most familiar with are the medical directors that I work with when I do the Commission on Accreditation of Ambulance Service site reviews.
Right.
And those folks are genuinely involved and well documented in the formalities of the organization, mm-hmm. and have quite a bit of input through not just the clinical quality domain of CAS, but operational safety, human resources,
right.
Education, even vehicle maintenance and vehicle maintenance records. So they're very involved.
Now, Kevin, let me ask you a question. Does CAS require certain requirements for their medical director reviewers? Do they need to be board certified? Do they need to go through certain training programs? What is the requirement of a CAS physician site reviewer?
Yeah, same. I mean, most of them are very involved. They're members of NAEMSP. They have taken the medical director's course. Some of them have taken the quality improvement course, and they are very involved. Mm-hmm. Some, on the other hand, don't have a lot of administrative support and rely on the EMS CQI department within the agency to do the bulk of the work.
Right.
So, even there it runs the gamut, and there's no hard, fast rule. But generally speaking, within the Commission on Accreditation standards, the medical director is well embedded in that organization. And sometimes they're employed full-time by the organization, and they're in the larger
right.
organization, that's all they do.
Right.
Others, have some type of dual role, being engaged in the emergency department. And a lot of them have other EMS agencies that they provide medical direction for as well. Yeah, I mean, it's not a hard and fast rule, but the success of the medical director is largely impacted, like everything else, by the size of the budget and the staff that supports the medical director.
Well, that's interesting because in a lot of places, medical directors get paid very little or even nothing to be medical director for their local EMS agency. So that's and you kind of get what you pay for sometimes, right? So if that medical director says, "Hey, don't bother me a lot because I'm doing this on my free time, you're not paying me anything," you can kind of see where that's going, right? So. And then, like you said, it goes all the way up, runs the gamut all the way up to, usually it's larger agencies that have full-time medical directors or even paid part-time, like substantial hours, type medical directors. So no standardization there either.
Some are paid, some are part-time paid, some are pro bono.
Right.
But at least at the level of the Commission on Accreditation of Ambulance Services in CAS accreditation, they are substantially involved in multiple domains of the organization, which is something that you typically don't see in non-CAS accredited organizations. In fact, we see it all the time with GNA, that the engagement of the medical director in quality improvement, in oversight, in hiring, waxes and wanes, and you said it, you get what you pay for. And so does the taxpayer. The taxpayer wants enhanced medical direction and state-of-the-art EMS CQI. Well, that comes at a cost.
Right.
That comes at a cost.
Right.
All right. So the human condition in medical direction. It's not. We talk about the human condition as far as us in paramedicine and pre-hospital care, the fire service. That it's a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job. We take a lot of stuff home with us. The human condition at home for many first responders is as chaotic as the human condition while they're on the job. And physician medical directors, same thing. Adrenaline junkies, working in emergency departments, running around, doing multiple things, long shift, no sleep.
Right.
What have we seen in our the GNA way and the relationships with our medical directors? And when I say that, I mean the contract agencies medical directors.
Right.
That impacts the medical director's ability to maintain engagement. Again, it's just like when we talk about with individual providers, is the attitude of the medical director has an impact on patient care. That and you can tell when we get the feedback back from medical director and you read the comments, you kind of sometimes shake your head and say, "Wow, he's having a bad day today," because these are pretty harsh. What's interesting from a psychological standpoint, I guess, or a psychology standpoint, is back in the old days, we used to meet with the medical directors and we'd bring a copy of the run report with the audit notes and we'd sit and actually talk the case out with the medical director. Now everything's kind of electronic, so you send it to them, they take care of their piece because they just don't have the time to sit and go through a lot of cases like this like they used to. But what was really interesting is that a medical director would review a call and say, "Yeah, I agree with the auditor. They should ALS this patient. I can't believe that this is bullshit. This is that. I can't believe this provider didn't ALS." They'd really get on them, hand it back to me as the coordinator and say, "Go fix this. Go talk to this guy and tell him he's got to straighten his act out, blah, blah, blah." Right. So you go and talk to the provider. 2 days later, you go back to the medical director and say, "Hey, here's the feedback on that call. Here's why the provider," and the medical director goes, "Yeah, okay, no big deal." And it's like, whoa, you almost wanted to fire this guy 2 days ago. Yep.
And it's their mood at the time, which impacts how they review stuff, right? How they feel about certain cases and certain providers and certain issues. And medical directors are human too, so they have providers that they favor, like, dislike. We had, again, another example, Kevin, is a few years back. A crew stopped on the side of a road as they were returning back from the hospital out of their jurisdiction as they were driving, multiple towns over to get back to their jurisdiction. And they stopped and they took care of a motor vehicle accident until the proper EMS crew of that jurisdiction showed up to take the patient and stuff. So they wrote a report on it. They did actually a pretty good job with that stuff. And they wrote the report and it went through our CQI process. And they they didn't do any care for the patient. They just kind of stood and chatted with him, and when the patient actually was pretty seriously ill and needed some treatment.
Yeah.
And so the auditor flagged that, sent it to the medical director. The medical director reviewed it and said, well, I know Johnny. Johnny's a good medic. I'm sure there's more to this story. The patient probably wasn't as bad as this is made to look. I think it's just blah, blah, blah. And they said, well, wait a minute. It wasn't Johnny who teched the call. It was his partner who wrote the report, who was actually the person who was talking with the patient. And the medical director completely did a 180 and said, what? I can't believe. And he kind of raked this guy over the coal, because his experience with those two was Johnny was a really good paramedic and probably wouldn't have made these types of errors and was willing to let him off the hook for it. But Bobby is, in his mind, not as good of a paramedic and feels that he's a little bit weak, and therefore the written document is showing his weakness as a provider. The reality is it's the same freaking document, right? And the same facts, the same fact case. And he completely altered his opinion based on who he thought was the person who was addressing the patient during that session. So, all those factors come into play. It's actually fairly common. And, as the agency, when you employ a medical director, you really have to look at their temperament and see if that temperament jibes with your organization and what goals you're trying to get to. And if you hire the wrong medical director, it's the same as hiring the wrong provider who has a whole different mindset to how they should be doing their job versus what you need them to do to fit within your organization. So you really kind of have to be careful of that and realize that medical directors are human too. They have the same issues as everybody else. We've had medical directors who've had drinking problems and lost their license due to drug usage and all that sort of stuff. And they were EMS medical directors before the shit hit the fan for them. So you can't. I think a lot of agencies, they view their medical director as kind of like the God on high, right? So we only approach him when we need to, when there's a real issue, and whatever he or she says is gospel. We just have to do it because the medical director said that's the way it's got to be. But the reality is there needs to be more interaction than that, because there can be issues with that kind of rolling over and just allowing anything to happen based on whatever the medical director says.
And being involved in the hiring of the medical director assumes that you get to be involved in the hiring of a medical, that selection process.
Right.
Because how many EMS agencies in Massachusetts have we worked for, or do we know through the context of our professional lives that they get the medical director that they're told they get through the affiliation agreement with the hospital?
Right.
And that a document that rarely gets dusted off.
Right.
To see if they're actually following the obligations.
Yeah. It sometimes creates different standards. So you have, here in Mass, we have what's called an affiliate hospital medical director. So that's the medical director of the medical directors. And that person typically works for the hospital, and the agreement is with the hospital. But once that agreement is signed, a lot of those medical directors, if that hospital oversees multiple EMS agencies, they will assign different, usually it's ER docs, right? They'll pick, ER doc A and say, you're going to deal with these 3 agencies. ER doc B, you go deal with these other 2 or 3 agencies, and they split up the agencies so no one doc gets hammered. And a lot of times you'll see differences in the care provided based on which medical director for those agencies, what type of job they're doing, and the standards that they're holding providers to. So one medical director for one agency that had that sort of mix, the issue was the providers had a chest pain patient. They gave aspirin to the patient, but they didn't give him nitro. And they weren't, fully convinced that it was cardiac, but they had a lot of risk factors. It really should have gotten, patient was elderly. It was similar to their cardiac pain when they had their heart attack a couple of years ago. There was all sorts of things in there that suggested they should have gone down the ACS route and done the aspirin and the nitro and perhaps fentanyl and, the IV to 12 lead and all that sort of stuff. And so when we sent that report to the medical director in that for that particular agency, the medical director said, listen, there's a lot of evidence in the literature that aspirin is good for ACS patients and improves patient outcomes. So they gave that. I'm really happy with that. There is not great evidence that nitro improves patient outcomes. So in my mind, the nitro is not a big deal if they didn't give it, and he downgraded it to a 0, meaning everything's fine, no issues here kind of thing. And so, we had a discussion about that. And I said, hey, listen, that's not what your other physician medical directors that represent your agency, your hospital that's overseeing multiple agencies. So for your agencies, there's one standard of care, but for the others, the other medical directors are saying they want that nitro given. And he said, I don't care what they want. This is how I practice medicine, how I want our providers to, the ones that are responsible to me. So, we kind of lost that battle in terms of trying to standardize across all the agencies from that one hospital that was overseeing multiple agencies. So, there's a lot of subjectivity to this process, right? To EMS, quality is not black and white in terms of patient care because there's such a high degree of subjectivity in it. And that subjectivity comes out with each provider in terms of how they feel things should be done. And it comes out with each medical director, each CQI coordinator. So a good CQI process tries to weed out as much of that subjectivity as possible across the whole spectrum of the CQI process. That includes medical directors by having those discussions with them when you feel like they're giving you feedback that's not consistent with how it probably should be done.
So you mentioned hypertension, but there are other reoccurring clinical issues where even experienced, well-intentioned EMS physician medical directors or medical control physicians frequently disagree. You mentioned the hypertension.
Right.
But we've encountered others as well.
Yeah.
Can you talk about some of those?
Well, I mentioned the ACS, meaning chest pain, but hypertension is a subcategory of that, right? And there's that is true for hypertension as well. So, for example, a lot of protocol over the last few years, the hypertension crisis protocol has been taken out of EMS protocols. In some locations, they're adding a hypertension protocol to their protocols. And so there's various, but for agencies here in Mass, for example, we used to have one. Connecticut did as well, and then they took it out. It's been kind of in and out a little bit. And in the absence of a hypertensive crisis protocol, when a provider shows up and they've got a patient who's got a pressure of 190 over 110, and the patient's symptomatic of something, complaining of something associated with that, a little bit of a panic sets in because you don't really have a protocol for that. And so some will opt to treat it with nitro anyway. Let's put a line in the patient and give them a little bit of nitro to try to get that pressure down. Sometimes with medical control, since it's not in their protocol, and they should be calling medical control, sometimes without. And you'll get different answers from medical control as to whether they should active medical control when they call for online control. But even through the CQI process, when you then take that to the medical director or the affiliate hospital medical director for that agency, who might be separate from the person who gave them medical control, and there's always a lot of debate about whether they want them to treat it or not to treat it. Some are hard and say, nope, OEMS took it out of the protocol, you're not going to do it. That's wrong. Others will say, well, as long as you call medical control, this pressure needed to be treated and the patient was really sick, I'm kind of glad you did it, and they don't really fault them for it. So that's differing medical director opinions about to what degree they want to treat that patient's hypertensive crisis, air quotes, right, hypertensive crisis, and to what degree they're going to allow their providers to do that. So that's one example. Another example, Kevin, is a few years back we had in Western Mass, we had an agency where we would flag calls, and one of their requirements was all STEMIs, when on CQI audit, would go to the medical director for a secondary review. And we were doing that for years, and then all of a sudden they got a new medical director reviewer. So within this category we're talking about with medical directors, there's a subcategory because some medical directors have paramedics, or in other parts of the country, nurses or some other medical professional reviewing calls on behalf of the medical director because that person doesn't have time to review calls.
Right.
And so you inject that person's acting as they're reviewing the run report on behalf of the medical director to render a medical director opinion. So now you have another piece into this that has all the issues that we just discussed for medical directors and CQI people. But one of the new medical director reviewer for this agency was receiving those STEMIs, and they were saying, they were scoring them as a deficient call, saying that these STEMIs require defib pads prophylactically for all STEMI patients. Now that's unusual. In most cases, prophylactic defib pads go on patients who are quote-unquote unstable. Then we can debate what that means because everybody doesn't agree on what stable or unstable looks like in a real patient. So that's a debatable issue. But they were saying that all STEMI patients get defib pads put on them. And the provider had a patient who was quote-unquote stable, right, 120 over 80-ish. They weren't tachycardic. They were having a STEMI, but they weren't pale, weren't diaphoretic. They didn't seem to be an extremis. So the providers went through the normal ACS route, and they got gigged for not putting defib pads on. And when I talked to medical direction, they said, well, a STEMI is an unstable condition, regardless of what their vitals, level of consciousness, or other indicators might be. Mm-hmm. Okay, I can understand that logic. So what we do, because we do agencies from all over the place, right? Whenever a medical director comes out with a novel thought, we're never sure if other medical directors are going to feel the same way. So we said, well, let's start flagging calls, because that may be the newest thing that people kind of want to give an opinion on. So we started flagging those for our other medical directors or other agencies. And another agency in the eastern part of the state here in Massachusetts received these calls that were scored a 3 or 4 because they had a STEMI patient and technically they're unstable, therefore they should have had defib pads put on them. And the medical director went berserk and was like, you guys are crazy. I can't believe that you're recommending this. This is a waste of medical resources. And he really got crazy about it. Mm-hmm. And so I understand that point of view too, right? I mean, I've never put defib pads on a STEMI patient just because they were a STEMI patient if they were otherwise so-called stable, right? They appeared otherwise stable. Yeah, go ahead.
Now, the purpose of the defib pads is in case the patient crumps.
Yeah.
You don't have to mess around.
Yeah,
it's already there.
It saves time, right? So
Saves
in time, when
So
somebody
it's
goes into VFib...
They're not interpreting the EKG through the defib pads.
Yeah.
It's time is muscle, and a STEMI patient, there's a probability that the patient will go into cardiac arrest and will need to be defibrillated. Get the pads on the patient before the patient goes into VFib or
exactly.
Right.
And that was the viewpoint of that agency, is that it's unstable, that a percentage of these patients go into cardiac arrest.
Right.
You can't always predict who will or will not. We'd rather have you prepared, because when a patient goes into arrest and you don't have the defib pads on them, you got to find them, get them out, make sure they're not everything connects properly and works properly. Then analyze, charge, you got to through all these steps, and that's time. And we know the time to defibrillation, it should be immediate whenever possible for best results. So their logic isn't necessarily wrong in that regard, but not everybody agrees with it. So we have...
Well, so their argument is, well, one side of the argument is that it's a waste of medical resources. To because they are expensive, these defib pads, and if you don't need them, then but it's included in the cost of the ALS-2 anyway. So I don't think that's logical. But again, that's part and parcel of when these medical directors conflict. And we're caught in the middle of it.
Correct. So I've got two standards here that are diametrically opposed and are actually a little bit extreme. Most medical directors fall in somewhere in the middle, where they want to see some signs or symptoms through assessment that indicate the patient may be at risk for deteriorating before pulling that trigger and saying, yeah, you should have put the pads on or not. And they usually look to vital stability and level of consciousness as the main categories. But there are others, right? If the patient's really diaphoretic, sweating like a pig and clutching their chest and I feel like I'm going to die, all those types of things. The anxiety's ramped up, all that stuff. So those are a case-by-case basis, if you will, with most medical directors in terms of who should get those defib pads and who should not. Whereas the two individuals that I'm speaking of in this example were on the extreme, where 100% or only if they really need it, kind of thing. So and we still don't have agreement, by the way. There's still different medical directors have different opinions and they weigh in differently on that, and we take their feedback and we try to find where the line in the sand is with them so that we can tell that to the providers, right? So for you, medical director, where do you think, at what point do you think the pads should go on? And we try to kind of nail them down a little bit so they can give us a little bit more of their thought process. The reality is the patient care in every EMS agency across the country varies in part because of the desires of that service's medical director. So you can have a medical director in agency A and right next door in agency B who has a different medical director. The care is very much different in terms of how aggressive that medical director wants its providers to be and how detail-oriented that medical director wants the provider to be and that sort of thing. So care varies widely. So when we do feedback, we have to customize that feedback based on what we're hearing from the medical director. In order to get that, we need an active medical director who's going to review these calls with us and that we can talk about these gray area calls. And there's tons of them. I just mentioned a couple to you, but just the standard of when should a patient get ALS, pick any category, right? A allergic reaction patient. There's a different threshold. Each medical director reads that run report, and some will say, yep, that one should get ALS because I've got concerns because, and fill in the blank. And another medical director will read the exact same report and say, yeah, I'm okay with you BLSing him. He doesn't sound that bad. He took some Benadryl before he got there, said he was feeling better. You guys gave him some PO Benadryl or whatever. I'm okay with you not ALSing him. And, the reality is that it's two different standards, if you will.
Well, CQI is caught in the middle. It puts CQI in a very and not only CQI but EMS leadership, whether it's the fire chief or the EMS chief, because here you are employing a system to reduce risk and try to catch everything, and then you have ambiguous, poorly applied, discriminate. Even applied in a discriminatory way. Yeah. With biases of forethought.
Right.
You're trying to teach, coach, and mentor, and they come back to you and say, well, I don't care what you say. The medical director says, this was fine.
Yeah.
Well, it's not in the protocol. So that leads me to, how do you get on the same page with the medical director? So how does EMS CQI, which is supposed to be employed to leave no stone unturned, to look for the risks, coach up the risks, reduce the risk across the agency to the provider, the patient, the agency himself. How do you get on the same page with that medical director to say, well, here's the protocol, here is the regulation, it's fairly black and white, this is how we see it as a risk, and we want to catch this before it gets to a jury, or it gets to the Department of Public Health during a license revocation suspension proceeding.
Right.
We want to get this thing on the same page, because it seems to me it's the old no harm, no foul adage that everything's fine if you don't put the pads on the patient, and the patient doesn't have a STEMI or has a STEMI and is fine. Mm-hmm. And you don't put the pads on, no harm, no foul. Problem is when just before you hit the ER, that patient goes into cardiac arrest, and you're fucking around trying to find the pads through your brain fog, your brain fatigue, your cognitive overload, your holy shit, we should have had these pads on because it was a STEMI. Gerard was right.
Right.
And now you're dealing with that, and now you're on the other end of a serious incident risk report.
Right.
You have OEMS coming in to do an evaluation. They're going to investigate. They're going to find that you did something wrong across 105 CMR 940. I mean, there's a treasure trove of opportunity. They're going to get you on falsifying a medical record, and you're going to have to deal with a temporary suspension or a revocation of your license, all because of ambiguity at the medical director level.
Well,
so to me, Paul, it seems incumbent upon us in EMS CQI and EMS legal to start having these conversations with medical direction and trying to close the gap on the ambiguity in the gray areas.
Yeah.
What do you think? What are we doing about that?
Well, I again, every agency's different. We advocate, you have active interaction with your medical director. It's just not possible in some cases. The agency has tried, and the medical director just doesn't want to. In their area, there might be a lack of qualified people who can or want to medical direct, so they feel like they're stuck. But it really, to get away from some of this stuff, you have to have an active medical director. And I'm not just talking about active at the 30,000-foot view. A lot of medical directors want to be involved in policy creation, putting a new drug on the truck, riding with the paramedics, all this stuff. But when it comes down to reviewing run reports to give opinions about the care, they don't want to do that. They don't want to spend that time because that's very time consuming, number one.
Yeah.
Number two, it involves forming an opinion about some of these things. And some medical directors don't like forming strong opinions. They're averse to medical risk. And their way to avoid medical risk is to avoid the topic as opposed to taking a position where they could be held, liable or at fault later on if somebody determines that decision's not appropriate. We've seen lots of cases that the medical director chose one course of action, and when OEMS came to conduct an investigation, they disagreed with the medical direction in terms of their activity and how involved they were, and even their opinion on calls. I can't believe you thought this was okay, medical director, because we don't. And the providers still got sanctioned, even though their medical director felt that their action was okay.
And the medical director doesn't get sanctioned.
No, see, that's part of the issue, is at least in the areas that we've been involved with, where the providers or the agency gets sanctioned. I can't recall a case where a medical director was ever sanctioned by a regulatory body such as an OEMS or a regional authority and said, hey, you've got to go through some sort of remediation too. And maybe it's happened. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I just haven't heard of it in all the years I've been in EMS and all the different jurisdictions we work with and all the cases we see and all the problems that have come up over the years. Very little of it has come back to the medical director in terms of his or her involvement.
Well, as somebody who spends a lot of time reading OEMS investigation reports, serious incident risk reports, Division of Administrative Law Appeal findings related to the suspension and revocation of EMTs and paramedics in the Commonwealth, I would say that I don't think I've seen even a criticism of medical direction oversight.
Yeah. I've seen a couple of criticisms, but they're very, very softly worded. And it's more, well, this is what the medical doctor thought, we disagree. And then they kind of get into why they disagree. But it's not very, hey, your medical director smooched the pooch on that one and really shouldn't have allowed that sort of behavior to continue on. Where's that person been for the last 5 years? So so there's a big disconnect there. And it leaves the provider and the agency at risk. We've also seen cases, quite frequently actually, we see where the provider will do some sort of behavior, OEMS will come down to investigate, and the provider will say, I've been doing it that way for 10 years with my medical director. And the medical director's like, yeah, I can't believe you did that. This person needs remediation, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, how come you've never told me that before? Because I've done it my entire career and you've never said a freaking word. So, and that's because the medical director's not reviewing calls. We have some medical directors who get upset when we come in and we ask them to participate when we send certain categories of calls to them for them to review to get their opinion, but they're not calls, they're not life or death, somebody killed somebody calls. They're somewhat routine, and they just don't want to be involved in that. It bores them. Technical violations. But we want to know, and we don't send them just because we want to send every violation to them. We send them because there are some that we really need their input as to where the line in the sand is on some of these issues so that we can advise the providers properly, and we're not getting that from the medical director. And I know lots of CQIs feel this way. I just met with a prospective new client a couple days ago, and they were saying, yep, our medical director doesn't want anything to do with sending calls, so if we hire you, we're going to have to figure another way to do it because they don't want to review calls. They just don't want to do it. So you can't stop the CQI process. You need to soldier on to improve care, but you're doing it in the absence of your medical director giving you guidance on how to deal with some of these really gray zone issues. And there's lots of them in EMS. This is not a couple a year that are in a gray area. There's lots of gray area and lots of things that come up. We just talked about 3 or 4 of them a few minutes ago, but there's literally dozens of them. And the reality is because the threshold to do anything is patients having a certain level of acuity, right? And that should, if it's triggering a trauma center, if it's a patient with moderate respiratory distress needs CPAP as a first-line treatment as opposed to a neb, but define moderate, right? Everybody reads it and says, well, I think they seem like they were in moderate distress because their rate was at a certain number, and to me, that's moderate distress, even though work of breathing might not be bad. And so, again, that subjectivity comes into play, and if you don't know your medical's thoughts on any of these topics, then you're just, taking a wing in your patient care, hoping that something doesn't happen downstream and that your medical director is going to defend you later on, and perhaps they won't because they've never even reviewed these cases to give you an opinion. So it's a big hole in the system.
I think that's an important point, that even if the medical director smooches the pooch, gives you bad advice, isn't following a protocol, has a different opinion on the administration of nitroglycerin for hypertensive crisis.
Right.
You follow those instructions to your detriment, you are ultimately on the hook. The medical director is not going to lose a day of pay. You're going to lose,
Right.
up to 180 days, maybe even more.
Yeah.
That's the reality that you are facing, which is one of the reasons why I say you got to have an EMS lawyer on speed dial, and I'd prefer you have an EMS lawyer on speed dial that has direct access to a national EMS CQI company. I know it's a little bit self-serving, but nonetheless,
Say it anyway.
Yeah. But it sounds like, Paul, that OEMS is pretty clear. And correct me if I'm wrong. That when it comes to these disagreements or these judgment calls with medical directors with respect to the statewide treatment protocols, OEMS is the regulatory authority, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Yep.
the statewide treatment protocols establish required care and scope. I mean, that's the governing document.
Yeah, and most
It was Soradala case where there was some ambiguity between the statewide treatment protocol and the CMR, and the Dalla magistrate found that the statewide treatment protocol governed with respect to
Right.
the standard of care.
right.
And medical directors are obligated to provide clinical oversight and guidance within those boundaries. Medical directors do not supersede protocol or regulation. You agree with that?
Mostly. I do know there are some areas in other parts of the country where the medical directors of every agency is allowed to modify the protocol. The protocol is kind of a general guideline. I think somebody in Texas had told me that they've got that problem in their area where they have a statewide treatment protocol, but their medical director modifies the protocols at will. And does so every agency said if you do other agencies around us, you're going to notice that agency next door to us using the so-called same state treatment protocol, they've got a different medical director. They're going to have all different requirements. We all follow 80% of it, 85% of it, but each medical director can decide that if they don't like something, they can modify it. So it sounds like for that particular agency over there, from the discussion we had, that there's more allowance for each medical director to make changes to that statewide treatment protocol. But there are other states where you can't modify the protocol at all. It is what it is. You can interpret it and you can decide how to apply it, but you can't modify it. So again, it depends on your jurisdiction, I think.
Yeah. Well, these disagreements, their EMS system learning opportunities, their system improvement triggers, they should not be rising to the level of a disciplinary event per se, but you got to do something about it. These have to be documented. There has to be some kind of formal mechanism to getting on the same page with these disagreements,
Right.
So everybody is following the same rule, and that may mean getting either the regional EMS authority or the state to make the judgment call, because we say the paramedic or CQI is in the middle of this thing, but ultimately the most important person in the EMS system, the patient, is in the middle of this.
Right.
And they need the appropriate evidence-based, protocol-driven paramedicine.
Right.
All right. So disagreements, inevitable. All right. So resources for medical directors, Paul, that could, I know they can call us, and we're happy to go in, sit down with the medical director, give an overview of the G&A way, data collection,
Right.
interpretation, the database, the risk reduction index, how they can be involved, all of that. What other resources might be available for medical directors to get more involved with learning the role of medical director?
Yeah, I think there are agencies like the National Association of EMS Physicians that has a medical director training program, if I'm not mistaken, and you've got a lot of other national organizations that put out some sort of guidance, or they have at least some tools that will help medical directors with their training, so they can, and there's stuff that comes out fairly frequently, and it depends on what the needs are for your medical director. So, you could probably Google that fairly easily, EMS medical director resources, and get some of those. I'm not sure if, does the Fire Academy have a training program, Kevin, for medical directors? Do you know?
I'm sure an EMS medical director can attend.
Yeah.
But the 6-day resident Fire Academy class is by and large for Fire EMS personnel that want to learn more about EMS CQI or QA.
Right.
And want to, for EMS CQI leaders as well.
Right.
Looks like a great program. I've done a number of Fire Academy resident classes. They're outstanding.
Yeah.
I haven't been to this one, but it looks like something that would be on my recommended course list.
Right. So yeah, and again, there's a lot of piecemeal stuff out there that some take the kind of that 30,000-foot view of being a medical director. Some gets right down to the types of things you should be looking to, you should be doing in terms of what calls you should review, that sort of thing. But it doesn't really give you the more, legal risk factors and all those types of things. So I think a lot of agencies, the medical director kind of has to piecemeal what their education needs to be in order to fill in the blanks and the gaps. So they can, call us or other EMS legal firms that you can call as well, that I'm sure would point them in the right direction and that sort of thing. But it's there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, to my knowledge, at least. There may be something out there, but not that I've seen widespread. And certainly with all the agencies we do across the country, nobody's come to me and said, oh, yeah, we've got a great training program that fills all the needs of a medical director in order to give them the resources they need to know how to do the job properly and where the risks are and how involved they should be and that sort of thing. So perhaps it's time that somebody put all those disparate programs together and came up with something more thorough.
So before we close out, the G&A Way, Girard Associates, for our listening EMS medical directors that hear us and have the same concerns and need some coaching up, what can Girard and Associates do? We got a call today. What can we do tomorrow to go in there and coach up the medical director with the G&A Way and all of its programs?
Yeah, I think the biggest issue is that there needs to be a lot more discussion between management, the CQI folks, and the medical director in any system. Whether they're using us or not using us, there should be intense discussions with that medical director. The medical director needs to be involved, not just in setting policy and putting new drugs on the truck, and giving opinions about bad calls. They really need to look at all the risk areas in terms of stuff like we talked about with defib pads and how do we want people to treat hypertensive crisis if they're in the absence of a protocol, and what's our view on nitro, the necessity of nitro. So when those things, and you get those things, you get those questions, you get those examples by being involved in the audit process, right? So allow your CQI folks to send these types of things to them with these very specific questions about, there's some gray area here and we'd like you to help us to get rid of it and get it as black and white as we can for our providers so we can give them good, solid feedback. So the medical director has to be willing to engage at that level, and a lot of them do not want to get that detail-oriented, and they actually kind of resent it a little bit to have to be that involved. One medical director used the term that I don't want to have to adjudicate every call with you guys and decide who's right or wrong, the CQI guys or the provider. That's the absolute wrong attitude. We're not asking you to be the judge to adjudicate anything. We're asking you to give your medical opinion to help both the CQI process and the provider understand your thoughts on how you'd like them to deal with these situations. Yeah. And that medical director is one of those who doesn't want to be bothered with a lot of calls that he doesn't, he's got his list of 5 calls, send me every cardiac arrest, every STEMI, every trauma patient that required a helicopter, and every PD patient. And it's like, that's it. And he has the caveat, any other call you think I should look at. But then he disparages any call you send him that he thinks is kind of minor, that's not worthy of his time. And that's just the wrong attitude. That doesn't help the patient. It doesn't help the provider get better. It doesn't help the CQI process know where the lines in the sand are so that they can teach that to the providers. So it leaves a huge gap. And all of that responsibility falls on the provider. It falls on the patient in terms of the care they're going to get, and it falls on the administration of that organization, because if their medical director is not giving them proper guidance and proper input and helping them to split these hairs, then who's making those decisions? And usually it's the CQI process, right? My medical director doesn't want to see this. I think it's kind of important, but they don't want us to send these calls to them. I'm going to weigh in about whether I think this is important enough to go do feedback to the provider, or if I'm just going to put it aside and not. So that what you're doing is you're taking that medical director responsibility upon yourself in terms of whether that care was appropriate or not, and that is not right. So that leaves risk for everybody.
And that whole, I could see the visual of that happening, and CQI being in the middle of an adjudication, who's right, CQI or the paramedic,
right,
and why the medical director, human condition, would put somebody on cognitive overload. I mean, that's a symptom. But that's precisely why we do not historically rate source EMS CQI in these EMS agencies.
Right.
And folks, they're relying to their detriment on these software programs that purport to do EMS CQI in real time. There's no human interface between the machine and the human being actually at the patient's bedside.
Right.
Creates all kinds of risk as well.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more to this, but the message is that if you're a medical director and you just don't know where to go, give us a call. If you have concerns and you think that you might need some legal counsel, call me. If it's monitoring and auditing of your EPCRs and general EMS CQI system support, give G&A a call. The fact of the matter is you're not alone. You got resources out there, and we'll have you back. We'll coach you up. We'll identify the gaps, the risk areas, the holes in the Swiss cheese, and our favorite metaphor now, the stuff that hangs below the waterline. The part of the iceberg of hidden danger that sinks the ship.
Right.
So we're out there. All right. Anything else you want to cover before we wrap up, Paul?
No, that's it. Get engaged with your medical director. Get them as involved as they need to be to answer the questions you need answered. And if they don't, find yourself a new medical director. But also keep in mind, this is a tough job for medical directors to do all these activities, especially if you don't have a budget to pay them to do the job thoroughly. So it's all connected. Medical directors need support just like your providers do, just like your management team does. This is a team effort, and we need everybody on the same team rowing in the same direction. So to the degree that you can help your medical director be a better medical director, you should. Help them with resources. Make sure they know what's going on within your organization, and don't be afraid to engage them and talk to them, because they can't be a good medical director if you don't engage them and ask for their help. So start there.
All right, well said. So this wraps up our episode of Have You Hugged Your Medical Director today? Coaching Up the EMS Physician Medical Director episode of the G&A Way EMS CQI podcast. To learn more about EMS CQI, the G&A Way, and there is a G&A Way, and the services we offer, visit our website at www.gerardassociates.com for the latest articles, tools, and how to access our national EMS CQI consulting support. Be sure to subscribe to Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube so you never miss an episode. Please engage. Please leave comments, whether you like us or you don't. We love some feedback. For Paul Gerard, I'm Kevin Kelly. Stay safe. Stay in the fight. Godspeed.
Stay safe, everyone.
On 5.